We are speaking to Will Johncock, author of Beyond the Individual, a wonderful book on Stoicism, and I definitely recommend people to read this book, taking the self into a bigger picture of the rational universal logos, focusing Stoic philosophy on community and connection.
The Via Stoica Podcast with Brendan and Benny. Powered by viastoica.com, your home for coaching, workshops, quotes, and Stoic content that inspires.
So welcome to the Via Stoica Podcast. And my name is Benny. I'm here joined by Will Johncock. Will, how are you doing?
Great, Benny. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I'm doing well. I'm very excited to speak to you. And for the listeners, Brendan might join in. He has some technical issues back in Panama. So maybe he'll join, maybe he won't. That's the question, fate permitting. We'll see if Lady Fortune is fortunate on his side. But otherwise, we'll have a good conversation anyway. So I'm looking forward to this. And thank you for joining us all the way from Australia, from Sydney, Australia.
No, it's a pleasure. And the viewers should know that Benny's been quite accommodating with the time difference. And he's up much earlier than I am.
Well, yeah, I like to get up early. You know, it seize the day, as they say, right? The early bird, it catches the worm. I heard an interesting thing. Someone said, okay, but from the worm's perspective, it's not good to be up early then. So you can
No,
have both sides of the coin
no,
as well.
exactly.
Yeah. But I'll briefly introduce you and then we'll get right into it. So Will is a author of a couple of books: Stoic Philosophy and Social Theory, Naturally Late, and obviously the book that we're talking about today, Beyond the Individual. And we started at the UNSW Sydney and Melbourne School of Continental Philosophy. He's done research on continental philosophy, Stoic philosophy, social theory, features in many academic writings and more public periodicals. He's a publisher, author, host of the podcast Techno Tales, Mind Tuning, and he has released some solo albums under the name Want. Are those techno albums? I haven't listened to them yet, but what kind of music is that?
No, they're guitar-oriented music from
Nice.
20 years ago. The last album was 2006. And so it's a solo production, and the band is planning on reuniting next year for the
Nice.
20-year anniversary. And the band is me.
Yeah, like Oasis is doing a comeback tour.
They have inspired me, exactly. I actually bought
Nice.
tickets for Oasis in October last year, I think it was, for a concert that's going to happen in November this year. So they had
Wow.
they had our money for 13 months. Not bad.
Wow. Okay, maybe you can do
I'm not quite at that level of fame, unfortunately.
Okay. And what genre of music is it?
It's really just house, like as in like playing guitar around the house, indie
Okay.
rock kind of with a bit of distortion, 90s inspired kind of indie guitar rock.
I'm definitely gonna have a listen to it. I like that kind of vibe.
Okay.
So it's that's cool. And this is also nice to hear, a different side from people who are into Stoicism, because a lot of people I see like Stoic people are more like the serious, but this is good to have, there's a lot of artistic people out there. And in your podcast you talk about techno, right? If I get it correctly, like the
So
Techno Tales
yeah,
podcast.
that's a real deep dive into what I think are the most important historical aspects and tracks within techno. And techno's got a lot of cultural ramifications embedded in it. There's a lot of racial politics embedded into it, given its origins in Chicago and Detroit in particular, in the black communities there. And it's often forgotten these days, given techno seems to be promoted and marketed as a heavily white European phenomenon. But that's the subsequent era of techno. And so at the moment, the podcast is really exploring those first generations in the Midwest of the US.
That sounds really interesting. There's a whole philosophy behind that as well, I guess. There's a deeper thing
There
to
are.
investigate.
Yeah, there's some really interesting sociological studies of techno, and philosophy has had some interest in it too.
Well, and this is the thing, like we always say, on the podcast here, like we're not here to turn people into Stoics, but we would like to inspire people to find their own philosophy of life. And it sounds like there's so many aspects of life where people can develop that, such as like music and other parts. So I think that's really cool to delve into that and see where it originates from.
Yeah, it's nice to have different interests too.
Yeah.
To be multifaceted. I think there was some characterization of the truly civic individual from the ancient Greek days as someone who was, an athlete and an intellectual and many things rather than being too absorbed with one particular thing, so to speak, to be participating in civil and public society in many ways.
Yeah, and that's why they had the philosophers in the gymnasium where the wrestlers and everybody was doing all of that stuff together. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that also really connects well to your book, Beyond the Individual, which we'll get into a little bit later, that interconnectedness and having all those things together. But I wanted to start with your personal journey of Stoicism. And maybe if you wanted to take a stab at, like, how would you define Stoicism to someone who is not really familiar with it?
So if I was going to define it, I would tell someone that they're going to find a philosophy that's systems based, and it's looking at them as a part of a system. And that's the heart of Stoic philosophy for me. It's why I became interested in Stoic philosophy. And this maybe will now bleed into my description of how I got into Stoicism, is that I was working and still do work to a certain degree in systems philosophies and philosophies which do look to trace the individual to a broader environment. And so what are our individual characteristics and how do they derive from or relate to the environments around us, the structures around us? Some people might want to call them social structures, but there's more to it than that. So I was interested in various forms of what is known as structuralism. This was 15 years ago, maybe a bit longer. And Stoicism started to get a real buzz, beyond academia, beyond the world of intellectuals. It was really getting some public cachet. People were mentioning it in sporting interviews and political discussions, and famous people were referencing it. And I don't know if that was necessarily the spark, but it's probably definitely where I rubbed up against Stoicism more acutely than I had before. During my grad studies, probably even my undergrad studies, I definitely encountered Stoic philosophy within studying philosophy. It was always part of commentaries on the ancient works and the relationships or the tensions between, say, Platonic philosophy and Stoic philosophy. And so it was always kind of being mentioned, sometimes only in footnotes, but it was there. It was something I was conscious of. I also studied a lot of 20th century continental philosophy. Foucault goes into Stoicism to a degree. Chris Daver goes into Stoicism to a degree. So I was aware of it, but I wasn't necessarily that into it. It was only, I think, when it just became so much more apparent to me through being out and about in the world, and it was fast becoming very popularized. I didn't make a deliberate effort to be interested in it, but at some point I read Epictetus's discourses, and I remember having read excerpts of it. Again, when studying, I'd never read the whole thing. I'd not had any need to. Read the whole thing and was amazed at actually how much it differed from the works of Plato and Aristotle and how systems oriented it was. And so I was very interested. I was mentioning this at work one day and someone said, well, Marcus Aurelius, blah, 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 blah. And so I'd never really been that interested in Marcus Aurelius. He'd come across as like more of a sensationalist kind of character to me. He was someone who was always mentioned in these gladiatorial ways. This is post Gladiator, of course, as well. And so I definitely didn't consider him to be a serious philosopher. But having read discourses, I thought, okay, let me have a look. And whilst I found that, look, I think there's an element of plagiarism from Epictetus' discourses in Marcus Aurelius' work. The terminologies are just too similar for there not to be. A lot of the ideas are directly lifted, and the terminologies to a degree are, but again, I can't really say that with any authority because I'm working with English translations. So you'd need to speak to someone who was dealing with other languages to really get to that question. What I loved about Marcus Aurelius' work was the physical aspect of it, the materialist aspect of it, the way he reduces everything to the flesh, the touchable, the tangible. And it really turned what I saw in the systems side of Stoicism, it made it concrete. And I have never encountered a philosophy like that. Really, almost unconditionally, nearly, I can't say it's unconditional because there are a couple of caveats, but it's as close as you'll get to a materialist philosophy, an entirely materialist systems-based philosophy where it says we're material, we're touchable, we're tangible, and we are because the world is a body. It's a touchable, tangible body. And so we derive our physicality from the universe, which is physical. That was what drew me in.
Nice. And I think that's, just going on that journey and going to Marcus Aurelius. And, he was obviously inspired by Epictetus. He calls him like his mentor, or like, obviously they never met, but So that's wonderful. And the interesting when I listen to you, there's so many questions come up, and so I have to focus as well. So that's good. No, before we do that, I wanted to ask, like, how does Stoicism, has it changed you and your life? Are you like do you feel like you're a Stoic practitioner, or how does it affect you in your personal life after you went through this journey, or is it more the academic side and the studying of the systemic philosophy? How does that incorporate for you personally and with your professional life?
I feel like I have to be very careful in answering this question because no doubt amongst your audience, you will have people who follow the Stoic tenets, and one is not to live it as an intellectual. One is to live it as a practical way of being. The philosophy is so bound up in practicality. And so if I was to come on here and say, I'm only interested in it for intellectual reasons, I would be justifiably crucified. So I'm not going to say that.
Not by me. So
I won't say that I'm a practicing Stoic day to day. I won't say that I walk in the footsteps of the Stoics in the sense of how they ask us to live. What I will say is that there are aspects of Stoicism which do inspire me and which I am always conscious of. And we'll probably get into it later regarding the book, so I don't want to say too much. But one of those ways in which I do manifest Stoicism step by step, day by day, is thinking about how interconnected I am with this world around me and how I am one of its causes and one of its effects. This is consistent with other systems views that I have. So definitely that part of Stoicism I live, I breathe, I feel as I move about the world. And I can't really thank Stoicism enough for articulating that in such clear terms. And I find it quite inspiring.
nice. Yeah, that's great to hear. And again, that's why I think that everybody needs to find their own philosophy of life that works for them. And it could be a little bit of this, a little bit of that. We have a lot of listeners who really appreciate that as well. So I really appreciate that view. And I think the interconnected part, especially from reading your book, and that's some feeling that I already had, and it made sense. It made so many things fall into place for me just reading your book. And I think that is a crucial part of it. So I think that that's a big part of the philosophy, and kind of to stay on the Stoic. It's like, why do you feel like it has made a comeback? Do you have a view on that? Because obviously you said like it was more of the academic side, and maybe because of Gladiator and people like Ryan Holiday and like the more popularized. And as you mentioned, like when you Google Marcus Aurelius, you see this buff gladiator type, and so it is interesting to see what kind of versions are out there. But do you have a view of why it may have made a comeback, and what is your take on
I have a very strong view. I believe not just a view, an understanding of why it has
it?
come
Okay.
back. And it's at odds with my interpretation of the philosophy. And it is something I lay out for viewers who haven't read my book, it is something I lay out in the introduction to the book, which I think is chapter 1. That reason is a growing trend towards individualism, and misinterpretations of Stoic philosophy will interpret it in a way whereby you can take control of your own individuality at the expense of the rest of the world or in spite of the rest of the world. Characterizations of the rest of the world as being out of control. There's nothing you can do about it. If you focus on yourself, then you can defy the odds. These kinds of characterizations, increasing political orientations towards liberalism and individualism. These are the reasons that Stoic philosophy has become so popular in the last 10 to 15 years. There are some authors who are piggybacking this and are doing very well as a result. Their works are much more popular than mine ever will be. And it's not necessarily because their takes on Stoic philosophy are more interesting or more consistent with what the original thinkers felt, I believe, but rather it's just that they've tapped into what Stoicism or what people find appealing in any philosophy now, which is a life hack. How can I take control of myself, etc., etc., etc. So yeah, I'm because I'm not entirely embedded within the Stoic world, I don't necessarily have any authority to critique this. And indeed, as I say in chapter 1 of the book, I don't want to discount the really positive aspects that Stoic philosophy has had on the mental health outcomes for people who have been feeling anxious or alienated or other kinds of adverse mental health situations, how they have been able to benefit themselves through that interpretation of Stoic philosophy. It's my concern, however, that it's not consistent with the philosophy itself. And I also think that there's certain ways in which that could, in the long term, be detrimental for people's mental health rather than beneficial.
I couldn't agree more with that answer, to be honest. Like I asked myself, because I've got this question as well, and I ask myself whether it's actual Stoic philosophy that made it come back, or if it's just the word and concept of Stoicism that made it come back, and people are just using that because it is something popular now, right? And you can see a lot of books where they just add the word Stoic or Stoicism to it, and just because that might sell a little bit more. And but interestingly enough, and I don't know how you see this, but because we the book Beyond the Individual is talking more about the interconnectedness, and a lot of the Stoic help book, the self-help books, and they talk about the self, right? And this is something that I was not really necessarily, but I was struggling how to combine those two, right? But when I see a lot of people who talk about this, there is a community boiling up, and that is creating that interconnectedness, right? That people are like, oh, we have a common interest grouped together. So it is interesting how that is part of humanity to kind of bond together and find a common denominator that's like, oh, we belong to something, right? So it is interesting where you go from the individual to the group kind of naturally. I don't know how you see that evolving in those particular areas.
I think in that regard, part of the appeal also, or part of the reason for the success is that the word Stoic, it has a presence in the English language, at least, beyond the philosophy. So it's something recognizable. People have an idea about what being Stoic means in a conventional sense. It does mean, in a conventional sense, being resilient. It does mean having personal borders, which aren't necessarily infiltrated by things that you don't want to be infiltrated by. So it's not necessarily the fault, let's say, of modern commentators for having misinterpret's the wrong word, for having steered Stoic interpretations of Stoic philosophy down a particular individualistic avenue. It's, I think, first and foremost, the fact that the audience for Stoic philosophy are generations of people who are already using the word Stoic in their day-to-day discourse before they even think about the philosophy. And so that can't help but have some kind of steering effect on how you're then going to read the philosophy, on how you, particularly if you read certain passages a lot and others very little. And if you're focusing on some of the more popular passages, which talk about things we have in control and things we don't. Another translation might say things that are within our power and things which are not. Another translation might say something else. But whilst there are differences that intellectuals can debate regarding those different translations, the general point is that lends itself to the kind of individualistic interpretations of Stoic philosophy that are also consistent with the term philosophy in a conventional regard in our language. So all of those factors, I think, combine to generating the interpretation that pervades now.
Yeah, I think that's also part of it is where it's more difficult to sell now because we live in this very quick, attention grabbing society, and being able to, when you really look at this true Stoic philosophy, that's really difficult to sell because it's not very sexy, right? But that's why people show up like with all these flashy words, and they kind of use that, as you said, because they know like, oh, Stoic means like resilient, strong. But if you look at the philosophy, it really means compassion, kindness, and togetherness. That's why I think, like, for example, like books like you should have more um, popularity in the Stoic scene for people who are like, okay, I learned something about Stoicism, let me dive deeper. And I think that's why, and I feel like in the first chapter, you really try to kind of, I don't want to, push away the self-help and the individual side, but, you know, but here's my other view. And I really appreciate that of what you do. And I definitely want to dive into that a little bit more. But it feels like,
Thanks, Benny.
I can't say this enough because I really, it changed my view on like, and I already had the idea, but it was more like I feel like I was always in this duality. I don't know how you feel about this, and I just wanted to dive into that. Like it feels like there's a duality between either the self or the whole, right? The interconnectedness. And I feel like in your book you really try to mingle them as one. Why also the first chapter is a little bit like I'm not trying to push away the self-help on the individual side, but I want to focus on the other sides. How do you that really kind of resolve that, made the duality aspect dissolve a little bit? But how do you feel about that view of like, oh, it's either this one or that one? At least that's what I personally had.
Yeah, I don't want, as you've indicated, thank you. I don't want to push away characterizations of the philosophy, which are that they benefit in self-help discourse and that they help people with real outcomes, real beneficial outcomes. There is something about how Stoicism is being applied, which is being rightly celebrated because people's lives are improving. And so I don't have the right to come along and say, no, this isn't the correct way to interpret the philosophy. I'm just a commentator. I'm I'm a couple of thousand years late and I'm a commentator like any of these other people are. So I'm very conscious not to negate, as I say in the book, not to negate the really individualistic interpretations of the philosophy and those which are purely geared for self-help outcomes, because there is obviously something functional going on there. It's working. People are using it well, beneficially. And also, who am I to say that they shouldn't be doing that? So what am I exhibiting when I do that? To backtrack a little to one of your previous questions about whether I live the philosophy or words to that effect, and I'd say that I do in the sense there because I'm being humble. And to me, and that obviously when people say they're being humble is a counter argument that they're not being humble, but let's just say for the sake of it that I am being humble. Recognizing one's position in a grander world structure where you're an effect of a previous cause, as the Stoics will say to various degrees, requires a lot of humility, I think. It requires you to recognize yourself as one tiny part in a grand whole. And that's what I try to do in the book, is not to say I'm a big part and I'm coming along and telling all these other little parts they're wrong, but rather I'm just saying I'm trying to impart this interpretation of the philosophy, which is heavily, heavily supported by citations, which might get laborious at times for the reader. But the point is that I know this is contradictory to some of the more populist interpretations of the philosophy. And so I want to show the reader, this isn't me making this up. Here it is in Seneca. Here it is in Epictetus. Here it is in Posidonius. Here it is. I'm banging the reader over the head. And I'm doing that not to show my intellectual chops, but to show that I'm trying to be humble and to say, this isn't my argument. I'm the messenger in a way. The genius is in the book. The genius is in the books that I'm citing. These are their words, not mine. So in that regard, yeah, it's about trying to be humble, let's say.
And I think from the way I read it, I think you had a really nice balance between, backing up the ideas with the quotes and with all of that information. I also think it is our responsibility, although we're 2,000 years late, it is our responsibility to make it, to form it and shape it in our current age, right? As you said, because it can get taken out of context. As a lot of you can just Google Stoicism, you see quotes popping up and people just focus on that. Well, there's so much more to it. And I think that kind of tunnel vision might have like first good things, but it might later on push you in the wrong direction if you stay maybe isolated or whatever. And what was your drive to write beyond Stoicism, to write about Stoicism in general? Was it because you saw the system philosophy being materialized, as you mentioned at the beginning, through Marcus Aurelius, and you wanted to build on that, or what was the drive for you to use Stoicism and to talk about it in such a way?
It was really my orientation towards the systems side of the philosophy. I originally wrote a far more dense intellectual book, which compares a collection of social theories and philosophies to various Stoic positions, called Stoic Philosophy and Social Theory, I think. It came out through Palgrave in 2020, I believe. And that was my first real foray into a long-form study of the system side of the philosophy. And having done that, I felt that I needed to devote one piece of work exclusively to the Stoics, and one book length work on this systems side of the philosophy, because I wasn't seeing it a lot in what I was reading. There's some great work by A.A. Long. There's some great work by William Stevens, Christopher Gill, but these are heavy work sometimes. And I felt that there was space and a need for me to write a really accessible book. And I hope it is accessible. People say that it is an accessible book which focuses just on the systems side of the philosophy. And if people are starting to think, what does that actually mean, system? What I'm talking about is a series of seemingly individual things, which are humans, and in the Stoics' case, other things too, trees and parts of the natural world, which don't stand alone, which don't live alone, which don't exist alone, which don't derive their attributes singularly, but rather are what they are thanks to their involvement in a broader structure, a broader collection of things, if you like. But collection is the wrong word, because then we might talk about everything being a collection of atoms, that's a side argument, which the Stoics wouldn't endorse. But I just want the listeners or the viewers to think about a system as being where everything about you that is you is derived from something grander. Now, that might be a temporal argument. It might be that you derive the things about you from something that precedes you. And we see this in the Stoic view on physicality. Your physical stuff, your body, which is seemingly yours and yours alone, derives from a physical entity that precedes you. And if you trace it back, it derives from the universe itself, which is also physical. That's what I mean by a system, is looking at or locating or situating everything about yourself within something grander than you, and you being a part of that grander thing. And that is a very orthodox, very fundamental, very simple, very uncontroversial reading of the Stoics that is buried at times in modern commentaries. And so my motivation was to unbury it, so to speak, dig it up, bring it to the forefront, and beyond the individual is the result.
I think you did a wonderful job, and I think that was actually going to be my next question. Like, what do you mean? Like, what does a system philosophy mean? So I thank you for addressing that there as well. But you did a really good job at explaining that, and also making sure that those connections are there. And you mentioned like you saw this very clearly in the meditations of Marcus Aurelius. Do you have like some points? So where did you see those connections, and where did you see the systems really show up in Marcus Aurelius?
Well, one of my favorite quotes from the very limited ancient Stoic canon would have to be when Marcus Aurelius refers to us as expressions of the wax of the world. And he talks about, this is, if you want to know what the Stoics mean by materiality, this isn't a bad way to think about it. When he I find it's just so poetic when he talks about how the physical stuff that comprises us was first, or previously perhaps, something that was a tree. It was something that was something else in the world. And he talks about how I can't remember the exact wording, but it's a system where it melts down and then it congeals into another form, and then it melts down and it congeals into another form. Now, for the more nerdy Stoic researchers out there, you might know this is the conflagrative cycles of the universe that the Stoics talk about, where the universe itself heats up and it kind of dissolves into a different kind of form, and then it solidifies, and then it goes through these cycles where it melts down and it solidifies, and it melts down and solidifies. And that's what Marcus Aurelius is getting at there in the meditations regarding the physicality that comprises us. That for me is the heartbeat of the meditations, because so throughout the book, it's a book about the materialism of both the world, of us, of our rationality. Really, that's a huge point, that he describes our rationality as material, as physical. And he does that because rationality for the Stoics means order. To be rational for the Stoics means to be ordered. And what order means is we need to go back to what a systems means. And it's like, how do all the different parts of a system work together, as they will say? And they work because everything is ordered. And that order, the way in which the cycles of the seasons repeat, the way in which flowers bloom, the way in which night and day recur, these are exemplifications for the Stoics of the ordering of the universe. And they call that the rationality of the universe. And our rationality is then twofold, because in one regard, we are an expression of that rationality. We're an expression of universal reason. We're an expression of this universal order of things. But yet we also have our own rationality, as they will say. We have our capacity to express universal rationality. So we have a capacity to behave in these ordered, structured ways. Meditations is just an ode to this. And again, in my book, it's like, don't take my word for it. Here are so many examples within the meditations where you can find this. This isn't my radical interpretation of it. Here it is. And I hope that came across.
Yeah, no, it definitely did to me, and it seems like you're always one step ahead of me with my questions. It's like, because I wanted to ask them. But one of the questions that came up as I was reading the book, and again, where I talk about that duality, where is that? Is there a divide between where we have the expression of the rational universe and the rational self? Where do they collide, or where do they come together, if you will? I think collide is not the right word. Where do they come together, and where are they separate? Because there is that individual, right? I think from what I have from the understanding is like, the more rational you become, the more connected you become with the world around you. And where do they kind of come together, and also where can we find the separation between it?
Yeah, and so this is probably one of the points where I don't agree entirely with the ancient Stoics, is that they will talk about how we are expressions of this rational world, and when we behave rationally, which essentially means to behave in a way which is conscious of our participation in this overall system that is the universe, when we behave in a way that coheres with that, then we're behaving rationally. But the Stoics grant us this capacity. It's a very loose sense of freedom, which we can go into later if we want, where we can act as though we are, they use various terms like cancer or an abscess to the world. And this is where we behave irrationally. And to behave irrationally is, to put it bluntly and to put it quickly, is to act in a way whereby you are not conscious that you are one part of an interconnected universal system. And so that is one aspect of the philosophy, to answer your question, where the individual seemingly becomes separated from the overall universal system. And there are various reasons why I have concerns about this, but nevertheless, that is for the ancient Stoics. And if you are subscribing to the entire philosophy, then that is one position that you would need to take on, is the capacity for the individual to be able to, through irrational behavior, through acting as though and thinking as though they are not an interconnected part of the universe, somehow being able to separate or divorce themselves from the universal structure.
Yeah, that's an interesting, idea to talk about. And I think that that's also why this, needs some development, and why we have our, like, now in the modern times, because there are people who stick strictly to the text, and then again we can, debate them whether, the text they've been translated, and whether those are the real words, and we miss so much of the text. So I think that that's why it is important to have these discussions and to talk about it, right? And that is also difficult to kind of grasp. How can we get divorced from the grander nature or universe around us while we are such an integral part of it? And if we lose that consciousness, like, how do we kind of miss that lockstep? At the end of the day, we are still, that's where I kind of struggle. We are still part of it. And how can we then fall out of it if we don't have that consciousness? And maybe that's where the freedom, I don't know, you mentioned the sense of freedom. Is that with the deterministic and the free will kind of conversation that the Stoics have, or is that a different angle?
No, I think it's related. The Stoics are determinists. And again, for anyone listening who isn't quite sure what that means, it's a causal explanation of the universe where everything that happens will be in a chain of preceding cause to preceding effect. And if we are physical things in a physical universe, then we are within that causal chain. So a preceding cause has affected us. We are the effect of a preceding cause. More to the point, because these deterministic theories of the universe sometimes involve discussions around fate, it would mean that therefore our lives are determined before we're even born, because the actions of our lives are effects of preceding happenings. So that's the deterministic part. And then there is free will granted by Stoicism, which I would contest, but in a conventional understanding of free will. But if there is, then it is definitely related to our capacity to act irrationally, and then to, as some of the Stoics will say, to be separated from the universal body. I think even that separation, when the Stoics describe it, is a very conditional separation. The reason I say that is that if we look at both Epictetus and Posidonius talk about our minds, and Seneca actually mentions this quite extensively too. Is the idea that our minds, the seats of our rationality, the very things which we would say define our individual selves, our minds consist of something called the daemon or the daimon, depending on how you pronounce it. The daimon is a trace of God for the Stoics. And what the Stoics mean by God is the universal body. So the very thing that we're defining our individuality by, according to some readings of Stoicism, the mind, our capacity to think for ourselves freely, that is a trace of the universe itself. It's nothing more and nothing less. And so we're already thinking through our lives via this aspect of the world around us. We're not thinking through something that is free of that world. We're thinking through something, our rationality, which is a trace, which is derived from the world around us, and which is a causal, deterministic world. So A.A. Long has written a couple of really succinct pieces about this, where he talks about the normative ways of being rational for the Stoics. And this is what he means, is normative means that you're behaving or thinking according to preceding established standards. And those standards for the Stoics are this universal order. So interpreting Stoicism as a philosophy which can give you any kind of freedom is really reductive, incredibly problematic, and ignores the key element of the daimon or the daemon, which is that thing which you're thinking with, that thing which you think you're breaking free from the world with. You're thinking through a device, you're thinking through an apparatus, which is the world itself to begin with. Your thinking capacity is a trace of God. It is a trace of the world itself. It's so mixed up. So and the literature we have from the Stoics is just not comprehensive enough to explain this properly. And so we're left with conjecture in the 21st century. And my conjecture is that there's such an ambiguity around the trace of the self being around the self being a trace derived from the world itself, that to ever say that the Stoics give us freedom, I just don't think they do.
I think that that's an interesting and for me very good interpretation of it, right? I think the more rational you become, the less maybe free you become, because the more you integrate yourself with the world around you. So that maybe that's why I think the title Beyond the Individual is a great catch, because it is where you go literally more towards nature. And a lot of people, they mistake the goal of Stoicism to be freedom, but it's really to have that good, peaceful, calm state of the spirit, right? Of that diamond, the eudaimonic state. So that's maybe the misinterpretation, where it's like, oh, you can be free, but freedom means to integrate yourself more, even with the whole around you, to be more part of it. So I think that is a really interesting part. And also, when you talk about things like God, and that's a very hot topic among the
Yes,
Stoics.
it
And
is. Yeah.
it's so interesting, right? And you mentioned this quite interestingly about in the book, and I read, for example, the Cambridge Guide to the Stoics. There's an interesting chapter about it as well. But would you take a stab at like how would you describe the Stoics looking at the concept of God and the theistic side, and even the natural side of the universe? How would you explain that?
I see from certain modern commentators, by modern I mean current, I should specify, current commentators a desire to rid the philosophy of its divine terminology, which is outrageous. And if you're listening to this and you're one of those commentators, which is what we all are if we're writing about it now, just stop. It's outrageous to strip this philosophy of its divine terminology. I'm not theistic in my personal life. I don't have a bias here. But it's disingenuous to try to discuss this philosophy without referring to God, because it sums up so much of the passion and the spirit involved in the philosophy for its progenitors, but also for its audience back in the ancient times. I haven't spoken to Kai Whiting for a long time, but he's a good friend of mine. And I remember him writing a couple of pieces on this. I'd encourage people to seek those out online. They're really fine pieces of work defending the use of a divine terminology, in particular God, in any discussions around Stoic philosophy. So then, look, people might be familiar about what the Stoics actually mean by God, and it isn't that controversial. It's a reference to the world. It's a reference to this physical body of which we are a trace. It's a very different thing from what many people to understand God to be in 2025, which in many cases would be an interpretation of a being sitting outside the physical changing world. The beautiful thing for the Stoics is that they're empiricists, they're scientists. They look at the changing material world and they derive theories about it accordingly. But they're also theists in the sense that they attribute this to something called God. For those who don't want to believe in God, that's fine. I don't believe in a transcendent God either. But it's very simple to just say that God is that physical world. Now, I know that you're right, it's controversial. I spoke at the Melbourne Stoic X conference last year, and I did a belated launch of my book, and they're wonderful people down there, and it was such a great day. And nothing engendered more conversation and more debate than the discussion around God at the end of one of the presentations. It was really interesting and wonderful to see such passion regarding the topic. But I think it's really quite uncontroversial. It's there. It's not going to go anywhere. It's part of the philosophy. Don't try to remove it to sell it to the masses, and think of it as the world itself. It's such a there are other interpretations of God in other systems of thought that aren't entirely dissimilar to this, but it does differ from many ways in which we look at God now.
Yeah, I think that's and I can imagine that conversation that you sparked there in Melbourne, especially when, and it seems like a topic where people tend to throw Stoic practices overboard real quick because it gets so heated, and I sometimes feel like,
Yeah,
okay, it's
remarkable
crazy, right?
remarkable to be passionate about a philosophy and then want to rewrite it with your own terminology. Look, I would say most people at the Melbourne Stoic Philosophy Conference are better Stoics than I am. So I'm not criticizing anyone there. I'm definitely not. That's such a wonderful group of people. But it's, yeah, I don't see I don't see any justification for removing any of the divine terminology. And indeed, doing so would just murder the language. It would murder the poetry of so many of the verses and so many of the writings. Yeah, let's not do that.
And in this conversations too, I was asked like, okay, so how do you define God? Because everybody has a personal, definition of the God.
Mm,
Maybe that's where the crux comes. Like, oh, but now you are touching something on, even the ones who don't believe in God. Like, I see myself as an agnostic, and the more like, and I think the Stoics were more pantheistic, right? And that's something that I could see myself in, like the nature as a whole. That's what we're part of, and the Cambridge Guide to the Stoics, they made a comment that it's more like common consensus of kind of the terminology used back in the day. And now I think
exactly.
that terminology is kind of offending a lot of people. But back in the day, it was like, yeah, you talk about God, the gods, Zeus, divine providence, and now we just kind of trying to steer away, as the kind of the church is kind of dwindling away. That kind of terminology tends to trigger people, but we need to take that beyond a bigger picture and have a good conversation about it. Like, okay, what does this mean? And I agree, like getting rid of those words will destroy a lot of the great text and the poetry, and especially looking at Marcus Aurelius, you would be able to take a lot of the pages out and remove a lot of the text. And I think that's a sad thing, right?
I don't know how you would rewrite. Well, actually, I do know how you would rewrite it, but I can't see what the point of it would be. You're exactly right that God is the world. It's as simple as that. If the word offends you so much, then it's not an issue with the philosophy. The world is this changeable, rational, ordered, systematic thing. That's what it is. One of the synonyms for that is God. There are plenty of others. Reason with a capital R, intellect, nature, that the Stoics use. If you don't want to use the word God, you've got plenty of choices in order to reference what is the universal body.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said, and that's something that I completely agree with. And I often question like how would the Stoics, because when you read like Seneca's Naturalis and on earthquakes, for example, and you see the science behind it, or at least his thoughts about how all this happens. How would you, maybe your take on how they would look at the world with the modern scientific views that we have right now? How would that kind of compare, right? The pantheistic versus the science. Like, how can they work? Because they were like, philosophy back in the day was very much into like investigating in science as well, right? Nature around us, that's where we've got to learn. How do you think that would evolve maybe their thoughts or views on the world?
Well, I think first and foremost, I'm not, the only one to say this, the Stoics were empiricists and they derived their system's interpretation of the world through observing its various changes, its repeated, reliable, predictable patterns of behavior. And in that regard, they were scientific. They were also philosophical in the sense that they were interpreting this through something other than what we would call science. But it's the hallmark of an era when philosophy and science are one and the same thing. And that exists for a long time after the Stoics as well. It's only seemingly recent that the two disciplines have been so divided. So I think the Stoics would be always interested in observing these patterns, because what they're trying to do is see the way in which the world unfolds itself. It unfolds itself as us as well. And that's part of their empirical inclination. I can't say what they would necessarily think of modern technologies and the like, but all I can say is that I can't see why they would have ceased to be interested in being part of the world and empirically analyzing and defining their world according to what they observe.
Yeah, I think that they would see the technology as like a preferred indifference. It's how you use it, right? And with the technology, I think when we go into the smaller parts, and this is where that individual and the larger picture comes into mind. When I think about something like the logos, a lot of people think about it like the big thing outside, but I try to go inside and see like, okay, if I can find it in me, in the smallest things, like the nature and the atoms, but also in the pneuma, right, the soul that we have, then there it's where you find that connection with the whole. And I think that that's where that kind of the intercorrelation between the individual and the whole comes together. So where that, where the self exploration really brings you to the bigger picture outside. And that's kind of where, maybe this is kind of jumping across the book a little bit, but about the circles of Hierocles, right? Those are I think that's where where you go, where you have yourself at the middle. um how do you think that an impact, a view of that could maybe impact the world today? Like, where do you think that how does that fit in with beyond the individual, and also how does that could impact the world today, where maybe not as individualistic, but taking things at a bigger picture?
Yeah, I say in the book that it's going to be much better, seemingly, for mental health outcomes in particular. Let's start with the individual, if they're treating Stoic philosophy as a philosophy of interconnectedness. And it's one where they see everything about themselves as exhibiting the properties that are shared with their fellow people. We're all expressions of this universal body. And the kinship, the sense of kinship that manifests from that, I can't help but think that that would be beneficial if you are feeling alienated, if you are feeling isolated, if you're feeling alone. If by default you are already, to some extent, part of a social body, and that social body is simply through existing, is simply through being comprised of the same stuff, the same rational substance, as it is translated, as other people. So then, from looking at the self in relation to other people in that way, it so follows that your sense of allegiance, your sense of collegiality grows with not just the people who you see every day, but people who are, inverted commas, strangers. Of course, they're not strangers because you already have so much in common. What manifests from this also is again, a greater sense of humility. You are one of these parts in a huge structure, as are the other parts. You're all parts, and you have this in common. If an interpretation was taken on like this wholesale around the world by the entire species, I can't see any damage in that regarding international affairs. Can you?
And that's what I was thinking about when I was reading your book, is like, I like traveling. I've not been to Australia. That's something that's, we talked a little bit about this before the show, and you mentioned that you just went to Italy, which is, I love the country. I went there once just because I wanted to have pizza. So that was great, and obviously see the rest of it. But
Long way to go for pizza.
yeah, that's some good ones in Napoli. That was good. But when I was reading your book, and I'm thinking, like, especially the interconnectedness of, and from traveling, you see that at a basic level, everybody wants the same in the world, right? We want to have a nice, peaceful life for us and for the people around us, and we have this kind of like inner core group, and then the outward, and that's like against, but we are against the outer groups, and the circles of Hierocles that make it bigger. You have the family, the city, the country, whatever. There's always something beyond that group, right? But from your book, and especially the highlight on the interconnectedness, that would disappear, because you would see you are all part of the same. And I think that that's something that the Stoics wanted to mention as well, with the cosmopolitanism view, where they would say we are all the same, and that could definitely, the world could definitely benefit more from us seeing each other as connected and the same, instead of as kind of enemies or different entities.
Yeah, it's really basic. It goes beyond Stoicism, even interpretations of the shared properties of humans. Heracles and of course Cicero has a nice Stoic commentary on this as well. I know I'm not allowed to call Cicero a Stoic, so I'll just call him a fan. But there are the ways in which they both describe this structure, so to speak. It's really simple. There's nothing groundbreaking about it. I guess what is groundbreaking is to step out of your front door and think, this thing about myself of which I'm so proud, whatever it might be, is actually a trace derived from this big blob of common stuff, which other people are also derived from. And I'm going to have to forego a little bit of my personal pride in order to learn a lot and gain a lot about my kinship with everyone else. It's such a small sacrifice for such a huge gain. And And to go back to one of our conversations, discussions, sorry, at the start of the conversation, that really seems like it contradicts with the modern trend around individualism. Look, I have a child, and the pressure to tell one's child that they're special and that they're capable of great things if they put their mind to it and so on is huge. It's the normative way of thinking. And there's far less emphasis put on the kinds of topics that we're discussing today. But clearly you resonate with some of them. Clearly I do. I suspect some of your listeners will. And I would say that in applying this, again, I'd go back to something I said at the start. In applying this, it's really as simple as thinking every time you do anything, every time you think everything about yourself or anyone else, think we're doing this as parts of a system, and we're all doing this with a shared attribute, which is this mind. But this mind, the stuff of our mind, is derived from something that's common. It's hard to think of oneself perpetually as part of something else when individual life is tough. Financially it's tough, emotionally it's tough. It's hard to default to this idea that I'm still part of a system when there are so many individual battles. I get it. It doesn't seem practical. The mandate isn't necessarily that, or the expectation isn't that you do it all the time, because as the Stoics tell us, those kinds of approaches towards sage-like status are probably not possible. But I just find that the more I do it, the more beneficial Stoicism is for me.
Yeah, and I would even argue like the more we go towards thinking like, oh, I'm not, not special, I'm part of the whole, and this isn't just happening to me, but this happens to a lot of people around me. Like if I have problems, then people around me are gonna have the same problems, right? So if we take that individualistic, then we can find more support amongst each other, and we can see, okay, I'm not special, but I'm an individual. I have my own problems, right? That's where that kind of duality comes. Like I'm an individual, but in the bigger picture. But if we take that focus on the individual out of it, then we can see that we can find support and compassion for other people who have, problems, because we know what it's like. So it's strange that we don't have that, right? That we kind of feed sometimes off the problems of others. And I think that that's an interesting view. And also where you say like we are focused on doing greater things, right? But the focus, the Stoics would say, is like it's all on externals. Well, if we focus on being great as a human being, having a good character and all of that stuff, that will make us be better people, and then it would connect us to, because then obviously you would have to look at the world around you. And I think that that's something that you mentioned as well in your book. Like the more you focus on that, the more you will automatically are drawn to the world around you instead of just focusing on the individual.
Yeah, if I can just say something about that, actually, that word external that you raised, it's important that you did so. Plenty of characterizations of the philosophy will look at our relations with the world, and they would disingenuously interpret the Stoics as positing our relations with the world as external relations, and as those with each other as external relations. They are not external relations, they are internal relations. If we are conscious that the thing which comprises us is a trace of a universal body, which is also shared by other people, who are also traces of the universal body, which is also shared by the universal body itself, which is the world around us. The thing we share as rationality is being rationalized, is being ordered, is being part of the system. And so our relations with other people are internal relations when we are conscious that we are part of this system, these systems relations, these kinship relations with each other. They are always internal relations. Where you might be able to characterize them then, and where people do, is as external relations would be where you are not conscious of sharing that the kinship structure with each other, of sharing the same traces of physicality and rationality with each other. Then they turn into, for the Stoics, external relations and relations of separation, as we have mentioned before. But by default, if you're living stoically, you're internally related with the things around you, and the world is not an external world. The world is one in which you are internally implicated as a part.
Yeah, no, and I love that part of the book as well. And thanks for highlighting that. Yeah, and that's something that really came to mind, is like where we live more consciously about where we are and what we are a part of. That will also make it all just more integrated. And then you would have to, see how you relate to that better, instead of what a lot of people do, kind of shutting things off, right? Oh, this is external to me, so I don't have to worry about it. No, but you are still part of it. And do have an interrelation with other human beings, right? As we talked about, that isolationist view that some people have. It's like, oh, as long as I'm just isolating myself, then And the Stoics were very communal. They said, no, you need to be part of the world and you need to do your things because
Exactly.
that's what you belong to. And there is the kind of the interesting irony of like, oh no, you need to be by yourself, the lone wolf character, and the Stoics say no, you need to be part of society because that's where you are. And I think that that's something that you really did well, and I love that they bringing the conscious part of your life and where you belong in your relationship with others, because that's a very good sense of that awareness of what the philosophy actually means.
Yeah, the social part is also important to raise. The Stoics have these two, as I mentioned in the book, these two definitions of the social. And one is that just by being and living rationally, thinking rationally, which as we remember is thinking as though you are a part of an ordered system. Thinking in that way means you're thinking socially because you're thinking through your relations with everything else and everyone who is also each a part of this rational system. But then they also do talk, as you mentioned, about the other aspect of sociality, which is being part of the public arena and contributing to your community and not being apathetic and being an active member of society, so to speak. So they don't propose a lazy form of self-identification as social just because you are aware of yourself as a part of a system, but rather they also complement that with this mandate that you need to be actively social. You need to be communal.
Yeah, I think that that's a very powerful message, and I kind of, as we start to wrap up this wonderful, I know I could talk to you for hours. I think it's such an interesting topic to talk. Well, obviously, we talk about Stoicism a lot. It's an important part of my life, but just having a conversation with you, I think it's so wonderful. And one last question before I have a couple of smaller, kind of the rapid fire questions.
Mhm.
Do you think that this can be, because this is also a topic in ancient philosophy and the ancient Stoic side, but do you think that this is something that can be taught, or this is something that needs to be taught, right? Or is this something that you can inherently have just by yourself? Like, for example, people say, oh, virtue needs to be taught. You need to know what it is, otherwise you can't live virtuous, because how can you do it if you don't know what it is? Otherwise, it might just be lucky fluke, right? But how do you feel about something? Is this something that needs to be taught, or is it just something that people would have naturally?
Needs to be taught. This is it counters current conceptions of the self for reasons that we've already discussed. So I won't go over that again. But as a result, I think it needs to be taught. I think the world would be better if it was taught. I think we would be more humble and we'd feel more connection with each other if we grew up with this being presented in schools, particularly in elementary or primary schools. Again, I think it contradicts everything that we're taught about the self and our relations with each other and about how we have definite borders that separate. And if I'm over here, then you're over here. And we each look after our own jurisdiction, so to speak. I think it needs to be taught. It should be taught. It should be schooled. It's more humane. It's more humble. Yes, is my answer.
I agree. I think education is key to making progress, and sad to see it kind of the state where it's in. I used to be an educator.
Okay.
It's yeah, and like so it's but I agree that the power of education is important, and especially with something like this, it could change the world, right? In a big sense.
When you were teaching, would you have been allowed to teach something like this, or did you have to strictly follow a syllabus?
Well, I was an English teacher in Spain and in Dubai. And in Dubai, there was heavy, topics that we could not address, even certain animals
Right.
and all. So this was, but you could still kind of, with language teaching, you could still kind of talk about certain things and see if you could
Yeah.
discuss this a little bit, just, under the radar. But you'd have to be careful in that country. So that was an
Right.
interesting experience. I can fill an entire, season of
Yeah,
episodes.
that's another episode. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, no, I really enjoyed, having you on, and I have to also thanks, Dennis de Gruyter. He's in the Stoic school in the Netherlands, who, pointed me to your book. Yeah, I asked him like, oh, I want to read more about the physics of Stoicism, and he's like, oh, read this book. And I think it all kind of comes together, the ethics, the logic, the physics. I think you really did a wonderful job there.
Thank
And
you.
I have a couple of rapid, questions for you, not too exciting, but just for us, like, do you have a favorite modern day thinker that you follow?
Let's keep it Stoic related. I can't go past the works of Christopher Gill. I think they have such clarity. They're highly intellectual at times, but at other times they're just so direct. And I find that I do more regularly go back to Christopher Gill's work than to other theorists. So yes.
Nice. And do you have a book that you recommend for people to read? Doesn't necessarily have to be philosophical, but Your favorite book?
Favorite book? This is a tough one. I don't read much fiction. So I think because so much of my reading has been related to my work, in order just to feel like I was keeping my head above water, so to speak. So I'm probably going to give you a philosophical answer.
Oh, great.
My favorite philosophical book is a book by a French philosopher from the mid-20th century called Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and it's about perception and various other things, and it's called The Visible and the Invisible, and it's a book in the category of philosophy called phenomenology, and it's not the easiest read, but it's quite enlightening if you can get into it, let's say. So if you're ever looking for a new form of philosophy in which you might be interested, phenomenology might interest you. It has a lot of novel perspectives on the nature of perception. And by the time Maurice Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology comes around in the mid-20th century, he's looking at perception as a bodily act. So not just something that occurs with our eyes, but something that we do with our positioning in relation to the world. And more to the point, how whenever we look at the world, we to participate in this interaction with the world in which the world is not entirely passive, let's say.
Nice. I see a lot of intercorrelation with the topics that we talked about in the system philosophy there as well. And the final question, this is bringing it back to your other podcast, that you have. What techno artists should we listen to? The one that you would recommend to us?
Ooh, okay. There's a guy there are so many answers to this question. I will say Robert Hood. He's Detroit era, second generation techno artist, which means that he was the first wave of techno artists are arguably around the late 70s, early 80s in Detroit, and the second wave come a few years after that. And he is part of that movement, is arguably one of the creators of the genre within techno of minimal techno. And so he creates this style of music, which is really stripped back, really raw, as people might say, and really, really repetitive. It's beautiful. It's a precursor to a lot of things, I think, like trance. It can put you in a hypnotic state. It's a wonderful kind of music to listen to whilst reading. If you need something to fill the void, if indeed you feel a void whilst reading, check out Robert Hood.
Nice. And I feel like, and on the techno journey, I'm from the Netherlands. Like, is there a lot of it feels like there's a connection between techno and the Netherlands as well, right? We use that.
Very much so.
Yeah, a lot of the big techno artists come from the Netherlands as well.
Yeah, in the 90s, the Netherlands became the home for a lot of hardcore techno, and that's a whole other discussion and a whole other genre as well. That might be less hard to read to than Robert Hood. Sorry, less easy. That would be less easy to read to.
That's my idea with techno, he's like, oh, use it to read. I was like, okay.
Yeah, maybe not Dutch hardcore to read.
Yeah. Okay. No, it was a pleasure having you on. And can you please tell the listeners and the viewers where they can find you and I definitely recommend people to go look for your book. Where can they buy it and where can they find you or follow you?
Yep. So the book is Beyond the Individual. My name is Will Johncock, and it's available pretty much everywhere. Everywhere you buy your books online or in person, you can order it through bookshops. You can find more information about me at my website, willjohncock.com, and I think that's about it.
Okay, great. We have it there. We will put it all in the description. And the final question, what is now beyond the individual? What else have you got in the pipeline? And is it philosophic related or Stoic related?
Yeah, my grounding in philosophy is in phenomenology and various related disciplines, and I intend to do a research project. I'm building up to it. It's a lot of work, and it will be involved more in phenomenology. At this point, I don't have another book on Stoic philosophy planned. I do have a couple of aspects of Stoicism in which I'm still interested. I actually have I should mention, a publishing house called Planktos Press, and I recently did a translation from French to English of a previously unpublished in English work by a philosopher called Julie Favre. I might actually have there we go. I have some copies here. Stoic Ethics, Our Duty to Each Other. So within my publishing house project, I will from time to time be translating some Stoic works. Yes, that's probably as close as I'll come to new works on Stoicism in the near future.
Well, that's awesome. I've got a new book tip, so I'm definitely going to check that one out. And if you have any other books, we'd love to have you back on the show again. It was such a wonderful conversation. Thank you for making
Benny.
the time.
Thank
I
you.
really enjoyed it, and hopefully when I go, down under, we will meet up, or if you come here to
Yes, by
to
all
your
means. When you
side,
come, you tell me, and I'll show you around Sydney.
Oh, awesome! That would be great. Well, thank you for having, thank you for being a guest, and thank you for the book. I really enjoyed it, and yeah, hope to see you next time.
Thanks, Benny.
Thank you for listening to the Via Stoica podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and leaving a review. Your feedback will help us reach more like-minded people on the journey to self-improvement. If you want to get in touch with us or find more information, you can go to viastoica.com, your one-stop platform for all things Stoicism and living better. And remember, virtue is the only good.